Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bethany Centrone. Suba and I will be the primary presenters today, and Howard and Rich are here to provide a commentary and some anecdotes that might help us understand these new rules a little bit better. And we hope through your questions that you'll do the same. So today's webinar will go through the significant structural changes under the new APPR regulations, where school districts will have discretion with regards to their plans, those provisions that have to be negotiated with your unions, and some landmines that we all want to try to avoid. Because of the time constraints today, we're not going to go through a complete and total detail of the new regulations, but we have published a very comprehensive outline regarding the new APPR regulations that is available on our website, and the link is there for you, and that has been updated recently as well. So let's get started. So clearly the biggest structural change to the APPR, new APPR, is that where there used to be 3 components, now there are 2 categories. The old APPR system was based upon student growth, as you know, local measures of student performance, and other measures of teacher-principal effectiveness. Now we have 2 categories, which include student performance and teacher observations or school visits. And loosely, these new 2 categories correlate with the student growth and the other measures of the teacher-principal effectiveness. So let's break down these new categories. Student performance and the observation / school visit categories each have mandatory subcomponents and optional subcomponents. Student performance has 1 optional subcomponent, but both of the components or subcomponents of student performance will be based upon student assessment on a state test or a state-approved test. Observation category has 2 mandatory components: principal or trained administrator observation, and observation by an independent observer, and 1 optional subcomponent, which is peer review. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. This chart here is provided for you just so that you can see what the breakdown of the structural changes are and the effect that that will have on the actual values in the composite score when you're done with your APPR plans for teachers and principals. So the student performance, each of the categories is worth 50% or half of the overall APPR composite score, with each of the mandatory subcomponents for student performance being valued at with the mandatory subcomponent being valued at a minimum of 25% and up to 50% of the total APPR composite score, and the optional subcomponent is at 0% or up to 25%, which is negotiated. However, we place an asterisk there because, as you know from the statute, if a teacher or a principal has a second student performance subcomponent and they receive an ineffective, they will receive an ineffective on their entire APPR HIDE rating unless the second optional subcomponent is based upon a state growth score. For the observation school visits categories, the principal, supervisor, or trained administrator observation has to be at least 80% of the observation category score. The mandatory independent observer must be at least 10% of the score, with the remaining portions of the score only being optional, for the optional peer review being up to 10%. So in the end, peer review on the APPR composite score is going to be worth a maximum of 5% of the teacher's total overall APPR score. So,
and just to chime in, Bethany, that these things would have to be collectively bargained, wouldn't they?
Yes, they do. Mm-hmm. Yep. We'll be talking about that couple of slides from now. Student performance, another change in the system, a significant change in the system, are the assessments. As of July 1st, in the new APPR plans, assessments must be either a state-created or administered assessment or state-approved if there are no state assessments that are administered. We may no longer use locally or regionally developed assessments unless they are approved by the commissioner. The regulations have indicated that K-2 assessments, as long as they are not traditional standardized assessments, will be considered approved if the superintendent certifies that they're not traditional standardized assessments and that they meet the teaching and learn. They will allow for the calculation of 1 year's expected growth. All other assessments, locally developed assessments, would have to go through the RFQ process to be approved by the state if you wanted to try to get any of your locally created assessments approved. And again, traditional standardized assessments may never be used for grades K through 2. And traditional standardized assessments, that's a mouthful, they mean a systematic method of gathering information from objectively scored items that allow the test taker to select one or more of the given options or choices as their response. And they include multiple choice, bubble sheet tests that are bubbled in by the student themselves, true and false, or matching. They don't include assessments that would be used for diagnostic or formative purposes or for screening under Education Law 3208. The mandatory subcomponent of the student performance calculation is broken down similar to the student growth component of the prior APPR, in that if a state-provided growth score is required or is provided, the state-required growth score will be the mandatory subcomponent score for the student performance category. If there is no state-provided growth score, districts must create student learning objectives for teachers in those grades and subject areas. Now, one thing that has not changed is that the student learning objectives consist of the same elements that they did under old 3012C, which includes student population, learning content, interval of instruction time, evidence baseline, target, Heidi criteria, and rationale. At this point, the Heidi criteria that's part of that SLO is set by the state, so that is not something that school districts will have to determine as far as the percentage of students hitting targets that would be set to get a certain score on the student learning objective. Now, targets are required to be 1 year's expected growth for any particular student. The superintendent determines what 1 year's expected growth is. And you may use a school-wide team or linked results based upon state assessments per commissioner's guidance, which is not yet available. Additionally, all teachers are required to have backup SLOs, even if they will not, even if you're expecting them to have a state-provided growth score. That's explicitly spelled out in the regulations under new 3012D. And additional guidance is supposed to be issued with regards to teachers who have, quote, small n values, and those would be teachers who have less than 16 students and aren't going to receive a state growth score, or other teachers that might be teaching like in a self-contained class that might have very few students, so that we would have to calculate the SLO score differently out of fairness for those teachers. The optional subcomponent under the student performance category, if negotiated, could be weighted up to 50% of the teacher's score. And that is a change from the proposed regulations, where previously it would have been 20% if there were if a traditional standardized assessment was used, but the regulations that were published were changed to be only 50%, regardless of the assessment that was used. If you want to negotiate, or if you do negotiate an optional subcomponent, you have two alternatives for that. You can have a second state-provided growth score, or a growth score based upon a state-designed supplemental assessment using a state-provided or approved growth model. The second state-provided growth score could be either a teacher-specific target based upon a state-determined level of growth, and that appears to be on a state assessment or state-approved assessment, not a state-provided growth score. If you wanted to use a state-provided growth score, you would be able to do a school-wide growth result based upon the state-provided growth score on the 4 through 8 ELA and math, or school-wide group, team, or length results based upon the state-provided growth score. So it appears that if you want the second state-provided growth score, the first alternative would be the only alternative that you could use for teachers that would not be able to rely on those state-provided growth scores.
I'm going to talk about the observation component, or the school visit for principals component of the APPR regulations. As all of you know, all observations must be conducted using a practice rubric, a teacher practice rubric that's been approved by the commissioner. The selection of the rubric is a negotiable item. The rubrics that are on the current approved list do remain valid until the commissioner completes the request for qualification process and issues a new list. There is a procedure by which a school district can get a variance to use an existing rubric that is not on the approved list. If the district can show, first of all, that the rubric meets the criteria in the request for qualification. Second, that the school district has made a significant investment of resources in the rubric. And third, that there's a history of use of the rubric that justifies continued use of the rubric. There's also a potential variance that is available for new innovative rubrics. If they meet the RFQ criteria, and the school district has to demonstrate a couple of things with respect to the innovative rubric. One is inter-rater reliability and the rubric's ability to provide differentiated results over time. With the new regulations, school districts can also now negotiate different rubrics for different categories of teachers and principals. That was something that was not available before.
Suba, one thing that I don't understand, this is Richard, is how a district could be using an alternative rubric and not have expended significant resources in doing that. They would have had to spend at least a year using the rubric, training people in the rubric, getting permission from the commissioner to use the rubric. Can you imagine?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. I mean, if a school district is using an existing rubric, I think it should be fairly straightforward to demonstrate the criteria that you need to demonstrate.
Yeah. It should be noted that all of the rubrics that are currently on the approved list stay approved and on the approved list until the RFQ process is completed. So districts aren't going to have to run out and figure out a whole new rubric by November 15th. But presuming that some of those fall off the list, and I don't know what would happen with that with the state, because if the state didn't reapprove it, they probably would have a reason. But there is an opportunity maybe for districts that have their own unique rubrics that were approved separately before and hasn't approved now, or try to maintain an older rubric that fell off the list.
Under the new regulations, the school district has to conduct a minimum of 2 teacher observations and principal school visits for each teacher and principal per academic year. For teachers, one of those mandatory observations has to be done by the building principal or another trained administrator, and the other has to be done by an independent trained observer from a different school building. For principals, one of the mandatory school visits has to be done by the principal's supervisor or another trained administrator, and the other has to be done, again, by an independent trained evaluator from a different school building. And I'll talk a little bit later about what training the evaluators need to have in order to be certified as evaluators.
I just want to clarify one thing, if I can. I just want to make sure I have this right in my own head. You can have up to 90% of the observation piece go on a principal's or observation, which would mean
correct,
45.
Right.
And if it's only one classroom visit, that could mean, if I understand it correctly, 45% of a teacher's APPR rating could be based on one observation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. That seems to be a little flaw in the process.
Just one. And we've had questions regarding department chairs who are not within an administrative bargaining unit, who are either part of the actual teachers bargaining unit or represented by the teachers union but in a separate unit. And we forwarded those questions to SED and are waiting for them to issue some additional guidance on that. The June 15th presentation that was released indicated that department chairs could either be a peer reviewer or could be an independent observer if they didn't work in the same building. But when we pushed that further to ask if they could be considered an administrative observation as a trained administrator, if they're administratively certified, we got a little bit of crickets back, but with a expectation that they would be thinking about it and getting back to us. So once we have that information for the clients to ask, we will send that out.
So because the rating could be so skewed based on one observation, it would seem to be that irrespective of APPR and what's required by APPR, the school would want to be, or clients would want to be vigilant about doing observations outside of the APPR framework to make sure they're getting a real understanding of the teacher's abilities. And then I would assume, for the purposes of a 3028 proceeding, the fact that you hit a home run on one day when the rest of the year you were subpar, that wouldn't save you.
We would hope. Yeah.
And for that same reason, I think that should be high on the list of collective bargaining priorities when we negotiate what needs to be negotiated with the unions, that it not just be one observation by the principal, that we could negotiate that there would be, at least that we'd have the option to have more than one observation by the principal.
And assuming you couldn't reach an agreement on that, and if all you could get is one, I wouldn't think that would bar you from using observations, again, outside of the rating process.
I think that's one thing that's kind of strange and undetermined so far in the regulations, is that it says that you could have other observations for non-evaluative purposes.
Right.
Well, non-rating purposes.
That's taken, well, I think the phrase is non-evaluative purposes. Now, is that only referring to APPR, in which case it could make some sense, then that's fine. But if it's referring to any kind of evaluation, then I think it ties the district's hands much too much.
Well,
Something that
there was a webinar with the state, and we kind of raised this question. So you take a teacher who routinely has poor classroom management as observed by just the principal walking by their room. Now, the day you do your mandatory observation, the kids are entirely well behaved and the teacher has control. Now, my understanding is that the APPR rating could still be effective while the teacher may be subject to discipline for all the other times you've walked by the classroom and seen students out of control.
Right.
Yeah, same thing with, for instance, a teacher gets numerous parent complaints about the kids saying that the teacher isn't returning work, the kids saying that the classroom is too disruptive, other kids are out of control, the teacher doesn't keep good control of the class, and these are multiple parent complaints coming in that that are the basis for independent verification of the teacher's classroom management skills. Again, that may not be a formal part of the final HEDI score, but my understanding is that those are all perfectly legitimate areas for counseling and potential discipline outside of the APPR process.
It's pretty outrageous, though, that it can't be part of the HEDI score.
Right, right.
I suppose the flip side of that would be if the evaluator saw very poor pedagogical skills, yet parents were effusive in their praise for the teacher because the teacher's just nice. My understanding is that kind of artifact, so to speak, is not part of the HEDI score either.
Right. So the superintendent or the designee of the superintendent can select the independent observers as long as they're trained to conduct the observations, and at least one of the two or more, if you negotiate more, of the mandatory observations must be unannounced. The duration and frequency of the observations and school visits has to be negotiated. The number of observations and school visits can also be negotiated over the minimum number of 2. The regulations state that the evaluator may select a limited number of observable components for focus within a particular observation, so long as all observable teaching standards and domains are addressed across the total number of annual observations. So again, as we were talking about earlier, if the school district is limited to two classroom observations per school year, it may be extremely difficult to hit all of the observable components of a rubric. So that may be an additional reason to try to negotiate some extra observations as well. There's also a provision of the regulations that says that the New York State teaching standards and domains that are part of the rubric but not observable during the classroom observation may be observed during any optional pre-observation conference or post-observation review or other natural conversations between the teacher and the evaluator and incorporated into the observation score. So I don't know if this provides the district some leeway to, if all of the portions of the rubric aren't being hit in the observations that have been negotiated. Perhaps there's some leeway for the district to have conversations with teachers about classroom management, about parents' communication, those sorts of things that might also be incorporated into the observation score.
I find that word conversation troubling, though. I mean, that seems to suggest that you have to get your information based on what the teacher is saying to you, as opposed to what you may observe about what the teacher is doing.
There's also, there's also a provision, and probably usurping what Suba was about to say, but the statute says that artifacts can't be used as part of the evaluation. However, the regulations say that you can use an artifact if it's evidence of an observable component of the rubric. And I think that observable component of the rubric doesn't necessarily mean only the things that you can observe in the classroom. I think it means the pieces of the rubric that are part of the teaching standards. So for example, some of the teaching standards that have to be hit with the rubric are demonstrating professional responsibility and engaging relevant stakeholders. You're probably not going to be able to get that through a typical looking at observation. You would have to look at artifacts. You'd have to have the conversations with the teachers in order to bring those in. So there are other things that you can use for evidence, I think, although it is it's much more restrictive than it used to be. And we got a question regarding who can be used as a independent evaluator, or presumably the trained administrator evaluation observation. So for the independent evaluator observer, the superintendent selects that person. There really aren't any there aren't any specific criteria for that person other than they can't be in the same building as the teacher that's being evaluated,
yeah,
and they have to be trained.
Right. There's no requirement that the independent observer be administratively certified. So, at least theoretically, it could be a department chair who might not have an administrative certification, or a teacher, or it could even be a teacher, a fellow teacher who's trained, who's a trained evaluator.
And as far as the 90% administrative evaluation, I don't see anything in the regulations that would prohibit a school district from hiring a retired administrator to conduct those observations. But I would wait to see how the guidance comes out when we ask about the department chairs who are administratively certified and what they say about whether they can or can't be do the administrative observation.
So the optional subcomponent of the observation is peer review, and that would obviously have to be negotiated if the district wanted to include peer review as a third observation or another observation. And that can essentially be any trained peer who was rated effective or highly effective in the prior school year. And it doesn't matter for the peer evaluation whether that individual is in the same school building or a different school building as the teacher being evaluated. So how do you go about doing the calculation for the observation component of the APPR? Each observation has to be rated on a 4-point scale, and you would have to take the weighted average of all of the observations to determine the final rating in the observation category. If you have negotiated more than one observation in a subcomponent, for example, if you have negotiated 2 or 3 observations by the principal, you would take the average of all of those observations in that subcomponent to determine the rating in that subcomponent, and then you would give that rating the appropriate weight when you average it with the other subcomponents. So for example, if you've negotiated 2 principal evaluations, and for one classroom observation, the principal gives the teacher a 3, the other classroom observation, the principal gives the teacher a 4, take those, average them out, 3.5. That 3.5 is then given 80% weight, or if it's more, if you negotiate to give that more weight, then you would give it more weight, but it would be within that 80% to 90% range. Then that 3.5 would be given that weight when averaged with the other subcomponents. The cut scores also need to be negotiated within the ranges that are set in the regulations. To be highly effective, the minimum observation score has to be 3.5 to 3.75, and the maximum score obviously would be 4. To be effective, the minimum observation score has to be between 2.5 and 2.75. The maximum score would have to be between 3.49 to 3.74. To be developing, the minimum observation score would have to be 1.5 to 1.75. The maximum score would have to be 2.49 to 2.74. And obviously the minimum score for an ineffective rating would be 0, and the maximum would be between 1.49 to 1.74. So within those prescribed ranges, you would negotiate with the union for what exactly the cut scores would be for each category in the observation subcomponent. There is a provision in the regulations that says that nothing will limit the discretion of the board or the superintendent to conduct observations in addition to those required by the regulations for non-evaluative purposes. We kind of talked about this a little bit already, but just to reiterate it, it appears that districts still have the discretion to do classroom walkthroughs or other types of observations to address any concerns that might come up. So if there is a parent complaint about classroom management, or if a principal walks by and sees poor classroom management, those things, the district would still be able to do walkthroughs or do observations, but if they're outside the negotiated APPR procedure, you wouldn't be able to assign a 1 through 4 rating to those, and you wouldn't be able to incorporate those into the final HEDI rating. It doesn't mean, again, that it doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to take action through a counseling memo or some other way to correct the issues that have been identified.
One thing to do would be to convert it into a directive. If you see a teacher not doing something properly, you can direct them to act otherwise. And then even though it wouldn't affect the HEDI score, if they disobey, then you have them for insubordination.
Yep. Yeah, we could do that.
Do you want to answer questions for the end? Or do you want to
if the questions relate to what we're talking
Sure.
about, we could address them.
Okay, so we got a couple of observation type questions. The first is about explanation of saying that a independent evaluator has to be from, quote, a different building. And the answer to the question is yes, it is based. It's beds code based. So for small districts that only have one school building, you're not out of luck as far as being able to use your administrators. I don't know why they didn't say school instead of building, but they said building, but the definition of building and the regulations is a different beds code. Yeah, so as far as if we're talking about it's the independent observer that has to be in a different building for the observation. So if you are, I'm not quite sure. And so you wouldn't be able to have an administrator observe a principal if they were in the same, under the same beds code as that principal. Normally it would be a chief or a superintendent. In a smaller district, I'm assuming the superintendent would do those, so they would have the school district beds code as opposed to the school building beds code. But again, that's the only, not being under the same beds code is the only criteria that is required by the regulations for the independent evaluator, so long as they're being trained. And there's another question regarding these questions. Sorry, questions are coming in from all over. You guys are asking good questions. Another question that came up is what happens if we have a district level administrator that is teaching one class at a particular school? Can they evaluate teachers in the high school, in the school that they have one class? I think as the administrative evaluation, that 80 to 90% component, absolutely. That's a sure thing. As the independent evaluator, my answer would be I'm not sure on that. That would be something that we would want to send to the educator eval question website to find out whether there's any kind of de minimis rule as far as being in the same building. I think the purpose of the independent evaluator not being in the same building is that they don't want the person that's doing that evaluation to have any kind of stake in the, in the teacher or the principal being evaluated, or any kind of potential bias because they work together. So with that in mind, if an administrator is consistently in a building teaching one class, that might violate that purpose of the rule. But right now, the regulations aren't specific enough to deal with that question. Question about a union grieving the appointment of a unit member to do an independent observation. Sure. But there are some districts that already have department chairs doing observations and evaluations of teachers. And these, again, these are either teachers that are administratively certified and either within the bargaining unit or within a separate bargaining unit represented by the teachers union. And in that case, that's part of their job description, so that likely wouldn't be grievable if the school district wanted to have them continue to do those. a question about coordinators moving their beds codes location to the district beds code and therefore being independent for all buildings. I would, you know, practically, I suppose on paper that would work. Practically, I would think about the purpose behind having those independent evaluators. If you have a coordinator that's always in a particular school working with the teachers on a continuous basis, they really wouldn't be independent. So you'd have to think about that. Again, the statute doesn't, or the regulations don't specifically speak to that level of detail. Okay, and then the final question is, doesn't peer review go against the idea of the outside observer for reliability? Now, peer review is different than the independent observation, and that's a negotiated, potentially negotiated portion of the APPR. And I guess that if that's something that you don't agree with, try not to negotiate it into your plan.
Yeah, and I'm not sure at this point what, whether I certainly haven't heard anything about what NYSE's view on the negotiated peer review will be. I could see bargaining units wanting the peer review on the assumption that, that it'll help them. Even though it's a very small percentage of the total observation score, I could see them wanting that. But I could also see perhaps some teachers being resistant to it because they don't want to evaluate their peers. So I don't know at this point whether your units are going to push for that or not. Let's continue with the next slide. Yep. So here's just kind of a summary of the observation school visit component of the APPR process. Minimum number of observations, same, 2 and 2. Both have optional peer review that's subject to negotiation. One thing we haven't talked about yet is that for teachers, again, this would be a negotiable item, but you could do an observation via video recording instead of live in the classroom. That is obviously not available for principal school visits. The duration, locally determined. Additional observations would have to be negotiated. The lead evaluator for a teacher would be the principal or the principal's designee, and the lead evaluator for a principal would be the superintendent or designee. And to be certified as a lead evaluator, there has to be a training course that's completed. It's got to cover the New York State Teaching Leadership Standards. It's got to cover evidence-based observation techniques, the application of percentile and other student growth models, including locally selected measures of student growth, application of approved rubrics, application of any state assessment tools used by the district, use of the statewide instructional reporting system, the scoring methodology used by the department, and specific considerations related to evaluating teachers or principals of English language learners and students with disabilities. So that's for lead evaluators. Independent and peer evaluators still have to be trained in 3 components of this. One is the New York State Teaching and Leadership Standards, the evidence-based observation techniques, as well as the application of approved rubrics. So here are the things that that school districts have discretion over. For the student performance component, the development of student learning objectives consistent with the SLO process determined by the commissioner is within the superintendent's discretion. The SLO process has to include a minimum growth target of 1 year of expected growth. The growth target can take several factors into consideration: poverty, students with disabilities, status as English language learners, prior academic history. As Bethany mentioned earlier, K through 2 assessments can also be developed subject to the parameters that have been established by the commissioner for those assessments. The superintendent can also select the independent observers and determine whether any additional observations or walkthroughs are necessary for non-evaluative purposes. For developing and ineffective teachers, a school district must formulate an improvement plan. So the decision of whether to have an improvement plan for developing and ineffective teachers is not so much discretionary, but the content of the improvement plan is within the superintendent's discretion. It should include, but doesn't necessarily have to be limited to, identification of areas of need of improvement, the timeline for achieving improvement, the manner in which improvement will be assessed, and differentiated activities to support improvement.
Suba, two things here. Could you go back to that slide?
Yes.
But when you say that first of all these things only say it's the superintendent's discretion, just to clarify, that means that we do not need to negotiate these things with union. The superintendent can do it unilaterally.
Right.
But this additional observations for non-evaluative purposes, my understanding is that if a collective bargaining agreement has limitations on observations, that could still be in effect, right? The superintendent doesn't now have the right to override something that's in a collective bargaining agreement on that subject, does he or she?
No, yeah, I mean, if there was something specific in the collective bargaining agreement that says that classroom walkthroughs will be limited to, I don't know, 15 minutes or something like that, then yeah, I mean, we would have to be cognizant of those collective bargaining agreement provisions and make sure that we're not violating those. But to the extent that the collective bargaining agreement is silent on that, it certainly wouldn't be a violation of APPR to do it without negotiating.
I just wanted to say that we're getting more questions in, but some of them are becoming similar, so I think that we'll wait until that period at the end to answer them so that we can make sure that we get everybody in.
Here's just a summary of the items that do need to be negotiated with the union. So first of all, whether to use the second measure of student performance. Second of all, if the second measure is used, which measure it will be and what weight will be given to it. Third, whether a peer observation will be used. What weight will be given to each observation subcomponent, again, within the parameters that have been established in the regulations. What rubric to use. The number, frequency, and duration of the observations, obviously with a minimum of 2, would have to be negotiated. What the cut scores will be for each heady category for the observation component. Whether teacher observations can be done by video recording, and the appeals process still is subject to negotiation. So let's talk about the appeals. Currently, under 3012C, so the current state of the law is that the substance of the review can be appealed. Adherence to the standards and methodologies required for the review, the regulations of the commissioner, adherence to applicable locally negotiated procedures, so basically any collective bargaining agreement procedures, and the issuance and or implementation of a teacher improvement plan or a principal improvement plan. Those are currently the subjects that are appealable. 3012D, so the new law, essentially has the same factors, except that they added a portion under the substance of the review that says that it shall include the following: a teacher or principal rated ineffective on the student performance category, but rated highly effective on the observation school visit category based on an anomaly as determined locally. I'm still kind of scratching my head regarding what exactly that means and how that changes, how, if at all, that changes what you would negotiate in the appeals process. I think that regardless of this language, the substance of the review, even if it's not related to being rated ineffective on student performance but highly effective on observation, I think it would still be appealable. I think it would still be related to the substance of the review. So I don't think this changes much in terms of what you would negotiate in your appeals procedure. So if you have a pretty good appeals procedure already, you know, I don't think there's much that needs to be done with the in terms of negotiating the appeals procedure. All right,
that's
so,
a question, though, isn't it, Suba? If you have a appeals procedure that you fought long and hard to get last time around, and it's a good procedure that ends with the superintendent as the final word, does all that have to be negotiated over again? The union has to sign off afresh now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, an agreement has to be reached, but if the appeals procedure has been working, and you know, it seems to me that it should be fairly easy to at least start with what the district had. You know, again, we don't know at this point which you know, whether there are bargaining units that might want to change the appeals procedure, and if we do get a proposal, obviously we would have to negotiate in good faith over it. But you know, if there's a pretty good appeals procedure in place that everyone's happy with, you know, it doesn't seem like you would have to start from scratch. All right, so what are the landmines to avoid? Obviously, the biggest landmine is the potential loss of eligibility for a state aid increase if the APPR plan is not approved by the Commissioner by November 15th, 2015. The deadline for submitting the plan for approval is October 1st, unless you make an application for a hardship waiver. The submission period to apply for the hardship waiver is between October 1st and October 30th. If it's granted, the waiver would apply until March 15th, 2016. You will need to show, we don't have the form yet for exactly what the requirements would be, or if it has been published. The website
just came out, yeah.
Oh, okay, all right. So I guess it has been published. The link is there. But I think you would have to show that you're at least making good faith efforts to negotiate over the APPR plan in order to get the waiver. So, you know, school districts should not consider this to be just a 4-month automatic extension. I mean, this is, you will need to start the process as soon as possible so that you can demonstrate good faith efforts towards putting a plan in place. You can also apply for a second hardship waiver between February 1st and March 1st, 2016. And if that's granted, you would have until July 15th, 2016 to submit your APPR plan for approval. Hopefully, you won't have to ask for a third waiver, but there is a process in place for that. The final APPR plan has to be approved by September 1st, 2016. Many pieces of the APPR, as we know, are not subject to negotiation, but there is a provision of the law that says that the district and the bargaining representative must certify in the district's plan that the evaluation process shall use the standards for the scoring ranges provided by the Commissioner. So there are portions that would have to be certified by the union, and obviously you'd have to complete negotiations with the union over the negotiable items before submission of your plan. In observations, you know, one of the landmines, I think we've already kind of discussed this, but we need to make sure that all of the observable elements in the rubric are covered, and making sure that we are proposing and trying to negotiate the ability to have additional observations in order to make sure we're covering all portions of the rubric and getting a good indication of teacher performance. And you know, for assessments, you know, we don't have approved lists at this
third-party assessments, yes. And one nice thing, I guess the review room has opened, and if you wanted to go take a look at that, but it does look like it's a lot easier to work with review room than it was before. But you'll notice when you start going in, and if you pick an option for an SLO or for an optional second subcomponent for the student performance, you'll click on it, and it'll say right now that there's no approved assessments for that unless and until. So right now, some of the options that are in the regulations that you have are actually pretty limited because of there's no assessments to use for those areas. So, so now we're going to go to some of your questions. So we'll go to, there was a question about what does a BOCES do when buildings or programs do not have different beds codes? And that's a good question. I'm not quite sure. I mean, the definition of principal in the regulations is a building principal or administrator in charge of an instructional program of a BOCES, at a BOCES. So it's, it's possible that since they're different programs, that the beds codes won't be required, but we haven't gotten that specificity in the regulations. Again, I think that now's the time to start asking, going to the educator eval or the email site, which I can't remember off the top of my head, to provide feedback to the regulations before the regulations become, again, final in September, because there are a lot of holes that have been left. And then another question with regards to observations and calculating the weighted average. Is the weighted average of all observations determining the rating based upon the overall observation or each of the components averaged? So based on what the regulations say, you take each observation alone, that observation gets a rating of 1 to 4. And how you get to that rating of 1 to 4 based upon all of the rubric elements that might be in there is locally determined. Then once you have a score of 1 to 4, then you average that observation with the other observations that are 1 to 4. So it's not, you don't take all of element 1 of the Danielson rubric and average all the element 1s and all the over 4 observations and all the element 2s over 4 observations. Each observation is its own discrete, gets its own discrete number based upon the rubric elements that were observed for that particular observation. And there are a couple of questions on how do we observe the teaching standards that aren't really observable, such as the teacher requires knowledge of each student, teaching standard 1, which is teacher requires knowledge of each student and demonstrates knowledge of student development and learning to promote achievement for all students. Teaching standard 2, the teacher knows the content they are responsible for teaching and plans instruction that ensures growth and achievement for all students. And teachers teaching standard 6, the teacher demonstrates professional responsibility and engages relevant stakeholders. And number 7, the teacher sets informed goals and strives for continuous professional growth. I think that those are I think that's a good question. I think it becomes harder now that we have this requirement that we have to give a 1 to 4, and that's what we have to average in. I think that's the help that the regulations have given us is that piece where it says that we can't use artifacts as a piece of the APPR score, but we can use artifacts as evidence of a quote observable rubric component. So the observable rubric component is that the teacher demonstrates professional responsibility and engages relevant stakeholders. So the artifacts for those would be participation in professional learning, contact logs with teachers, websites, those kinds of things. And I think that teacher acquiring knowledge of each student, that's a good pre-conference kind of a conversation to have with a teacher about how they're setting up their lesson plans, how they're differentiating instructions, for example. A post-conference, if you've noticed during the session or during the observation that they haven't differentiated instruction or that there were students that were struggling in class and how they were going to be able to address those situations at a later date. So I think that we're going to have to be creative on a go-forward basis to try to get those elements into the observation format that the regulations are now requiring. We've
had a couple of questions about negotiations and submission of plan. One question is, how can we start negotiating in good faith when we do not have the approved rubrics and the state-approved assessments for SLOs? That's a very good question, and I just heard from one of our districts this morning that the union, that their bargaining unit doesn't want to start negotiating with the district, even though the district had proposed to begin the process for this very reason. My perspective on it is that there are still portions of this that that can be negotiated. So, my suggestion would be to at least approach the union with a date to begin negotiations over the elements of this that can be negotiated, such as the number of observations, frequency of observations, duration of observations, whether a peer observation will be used. Those are things that don't necessarily depend upon the approval of the rubrics and the state-approved assessments. So, and if the union comes back to you and says, we don't even want to start the process until we have more information about the rubrics, at least you will be able to demonstrate that you made the effort in good faith to start bargaining. I think it'll help you when you make the application for the hardship waiver. Another question is, pardon me, this one here? Yep. Yeah, if in the past year under 3012C, the district's APPR plan has language of collaboration within the SLO process, does this become a mandated subject of bargaining? Under 3012D, does the new legislation allow for a new starting point and status that defines it as not a subject of negotiation? That's a very good question as well. Currently, under the current law, the development of the student learning objectives is within the superintendent's discretion.
You've already given up.
Yeah, but if you have negotiated with the union over a process to collaborate on the development of student learning objectives, I'm not sure what PERB would say if we then unilaterally tried to impose the student learning objectives, and the union were to file an improper practice charge. That's a good question.
I mean, I think that the language in the new regulations that state unequivocally that the superintendent must set what is 1 year's expected growth would give a district that had worked together with their unions to identify what the targets were, a lot of ammunition to say that no, it has to be the superintendent because that's specifically stated in the regulations, which wasn't as clear under 3012C that was the requirement. The SLO process is under the superintendent's discretion, but they have specified more clearly now what that means. So I think that there would be, you would have a good argument to say that at least it's setting what that minimum target would be, meaning that the minimum target being 1 year's expected growth, and then you could collaborate beyond that. But, as you know, these are all changing times, and we would have to, you don't find out until PERB says whatever they say at the end. So I think it's a double-edged sword, because if you do start negotiating over it because you thought you had to negotiate over it because you had in the past, then you might have lost that non-mandatory piece of it. But I think that it may be something that you want to talk about as a strategy. Any more questions? Okay. Well, I think we've answered all of the questions that were sent over.
And if there are any that we didn't get to, please feel free to contact any of us outside this webinar, and we can talk about your questions.